we're looking at the behavioural approach to explaining phobias. We're going to be looking at specifically the two-process model and classical and operant conditioning, which we have already encountered when we looked at approaches. So if you remember, last lesson we looked at the characteristics of phobias, and the behavioural approach is geared to actually explaining the key behavioural characteristics of phobia, which were panic, avoidance and endurance. We're specifically going to be looking at avoidance in this case. The two-process model is the one that you need to understand, which is was developed by Moore, I think that's how it's said anyway. He said basically that phobias are learnt by classical conditioning, so we learn via association initially, so we associate being afraid with whatever it is we are afraid of. And then it's maintained by operant conditioning. Two examples I've got down the bottom here are about little Albert. And we did talk about little Albert when we were looking at approaches. But what I'd like you to do is you click on this link down here, you should be able to watch little Albert study. So we're just going to go into a little bit more detail right now. So, to remind you, classical conditioning is when we learn via association. In relation to phobia, what I mean here is that we initially have no fear to something, we call it a neutral stimulus, where something that we are afraid of already triggers a fear response. And we associate those two things together and then become afraid of that neutral stimulus. Right, so let's just explain what I mean by that. In this case, all right, you've got the hammer. Hammer made a really, really loud noise. And this scared little Albert. And the hammer is our unconditioned stimulus. Now, loud noise is going to make us afraid. And now that becomes our unconditioned response. Next, after lots and lots of times of is that we pair the rat, which is your neutral stimulus. So generally we aren't afraid of rats. So basically we pair the rat, which is our neutral stimulus, we're not normally afraid of rats, with the loud bang made by the hammer, our unconditioned stimulus. That creates, again, our unconditioned response. And because we've learnt via association, it eventually becomes our conditioned stimulus and our conditioned response. So we become afraid of the rat even without the bang of the hammer. So basically we're saying that the phobia was initially acquired via this association. However, this doesn't explain why people continue to feel fearful. Nor does it explain why they avoid the feared object. And this is the second part of the two-process model. This is just to explain that little Albert actually became afraid of Santa Claus because he was white and had a white fluffy beard. Right, operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, to remind you, takes place when our behaviour is rewarded, reinforced, and this is done by either negative or positive reinforcement or punishment. Remember, negative reinforcement is removing something which we don't like, and positive reinforcement is giving us something which we do like. Operant conditioning is the avoidance, or in this case, the avoidance or escape from the phobic stimulus reduces our fear, so it's making us feel better. Now, is this positive or negative reinforcement? It is negative reinforcement. It's removing the fear, which is a really unpleasant feeling. All right, let's have a look at this scenario. Often in the exam you can be given a case study or an example and asked to explain why in this scenario, okay, or explain the two-process model using this scenario. Let's identify the classical conditioning parts and the operant conditioning parts. So Harry has a phobia of swans. As a child he was bitten by a swan whilst feeding it bread. Harry feels anxious when he thinks about swans and becomes very afraid whenever he sees one up close. He now avoids swans. Right, so if we have a look up here, all right, this bit here, this is our classical conditioning. This was the event that started him feeling phobic. He then feels anxious when he thinks about swans. So this is this unpleasant feeling here, feeling anxious when he thinks. And so he avoids it. And that is our negative reinforcement here. Okay? It makes him feel better to avoid a swan, so he becomes negatively reinforced. So now I want to look at how you might answer a question on this in the exam. So we're going to be looking at outline the two-process model of phobias. Keywords here is outline, two-process model, and we also need to speak about the fact that it's asking us for 4 marks, which is accurate detail, but we don't need to be going on and on and on. Let's have a look at my answer. The first thing I've stated that the first things is acquired by classical conditioning. But in the next section, I've gone on to explain what I mean by how it's acquired by classical conditioning. I then said that it's maintained by operant conditioning, and again, I've gone on to explain what I mean. So I'm kind of doing the PEE bit. I have given the example here of Little Albert, but I haven't given an example of what I mean by negative reinforcement in as much detail as a specific example, but you can see that I have explained it here in some ways. I've given an example. If I wanted to make it better, I suppose I could add an example. So let's move on to evaluation. What's really, really good about the two-process model is it's really good at explaining how phobias can be maintained by operant conditioning. It makes sense to us, doesn't it? In actual fact, you can have a look at a study there that says that 50% of people with specific fear of driving remember having a traumatic experience whilst driving. For example, I may have told some of you this, I cannot remember, but when I was a child, standing outside the school gates, and a magpie came and landed on my head and started pecking at my hair. I ran to the car, got in the car, and it followed me, and then started pecking at the window at me. Really, really frightening. And for years and years and years, I've been afraid of birds. So that was my traumatic experience, my rapid learning through association to be afraid of birds. Secondly, the really good thing about this is it's really good in terms of application of therapy. Therapy here actually works really, really, really well. I'm not going to go into much detail on this because we're going to be looking at this next lesson. Alright, so the next point is there an alternative explanation to learning phobias? Not all avoidances for phobias are a result of anxiety reduction. For example, if you're an agoraphobic, someone who doesn't like to get outside, who feels afraid of going outside, yes, they are avoiding it by staying inside, but generally it's motivated by a feeling of safety, which is actually a positive feeling. And so, you know, it's not necessarily explaining it in the same way that the two-process model actually does. Also, does everybody with a phobia have a traumatic experience? Well, no. Some people can't even think about that traumatic experience. I mean, who, for example, has ever had a traumatic experience with yellow? Or one that they know of, anyway. And some people, yes, some people are actually afraid of the word yellow or yellow the colour. But here's a piece of research. Menzies and Clark carried out a study on children suffering from water phobia, and only 2% of them reported a frightening encounter with water. They don't know why they were suddenly afraid of water. Next evaluation point. Why are the most common phobias? Generally, most people are afraid of spiders, snakes, heights, water. And this is actually most likely due to evolutionary factors, because being afraid of something is actually an adaptive response. It's the flight or fight response that we've done when we did biopsychology. It's good to be afraid because it helps us run. Okay, get away from whatever it is, get our muscles working. And Oss notes that most people are afraid of snakes, germs, aeroplanes, heights. They've had no particular unpleasant experience with any of these situations. And he said that actually this is something we call biological preparedness. It's an innate disposition to easily acquire certain fears of things that we should be afraid of. I don't know if I told anyone again, another one of my little stories. When I was in Australia, I suddenly found myself jumping up some steps. And I noticed that the reason why I'd done this was because of a great big fat snake on this step. And I didn't realise there was a snake there until I actually jumped over the snake. Because our bodies are biologically prepared to make sure we... Right, so let's have a look at an assessment question for the evaluation. Explain one limitation of the two-process model for 4 marks. Right, as I've always said to you, we need to think about spelling. So let's have a look. This is my S here. One limitation. Spelling. I'm introducing the examiner to what I'm about to say. Now, after my S, it's my point. So my point is that it is an incomplete explanation of phobias. So this is my P. Now I need to explain what I mean, so my E. So this means it doesn't explain why many people with fears of snakes, heights, etc. have no particular experiences of any of these situations. So I'm explaining what I mean here. Now I'm going to give my example. Next bit here, example, is that it could be evolutionary factors like biological preparedness, okay, instead. And the last bit, my link. Link is linking back. This is because it has an important role in phobias, but the two-factor model doesn't mention this. Alright, so that's it for this session. Next lesson we'll be looking at behavioural treatments for phobias.